All right, so what I want to talk to you today is this idea of gross and net primary productivity and energy transfers between the trophic levels. These are both really, really simple concepts, and they kind of lead on from our work that we've done about food webs and food chains. And we sort of discussed elements of them previously, and you will have discussed elements of them previously at GCSE. So this is why I'm just going to do a quick video tutorial for you kind of at the end of our feedback lesson on this, because it's not something that I would typically devote an entire lesson to. So let me just move that box out of the way. Gross primary productivity is the rate at which plants make new material by photosynthesis. And there are a few different units that you can use and a few different ways that you might measure it. They include units of biomass area over time, so GM squared per year. They can include grams of carbon assimilated, so this is grams carbon meter squared per year, or units of energy, so kilojoules per meter squared per year. Any of those are absolutely acceptable as units of measurement. Either way, this is very, very difficult to measure. It usually involves finding the mass of representative samples and then multiplying them for the whole ecosystem. So finding the biomass, so how much it physically weighs per meter squared of area per year, if that makes sense. And then you would obviously take samples. If you wanted to know the gross primary productivity of an entire rainforest, you obviously couldn't do that. So you would do sampling and then scale it up for the whole ecosystem. Either way, GPP is particularly difficult to measure. Now, plants use at least 25% of the material they produce for their own metabolic needs. Biggest kind of metabolic need there is respiration. And then the rest of the material, so that other kind of 75% or less, is then stored as new tissue in plants. And obviously that new tissue is what the primary consumers will come along and eat. Now we can use this to do a calculation, and we can do the net primary productivity, which is the NPP, and that equals the gross, so our gross primary productivity minus the R, which are your energy losses due to respiration. Now, the NPP of different ecosystems has been estimated, and it depends on all of the biotic and abiotic factors that affect plant growth. So if you have a look in your textbook on this, they've got the NPPs of different ecosystems. I do believe that rainforests are high up there in terms of the NPP. Open ocean is quite high up there. So you can calculate the NPP for all the various different ecosystems that exist on our planet. So that is what gross primary productivity is and what net primary productivity is. Your biggest kind of takeaway from this slide, and the biggest kind of two things that you need to be able to do, are define what they both are and calculate them if you are given various bits of information in a question. So the next thing we need to look at is about energy transfers. So we can calculate the efficiency of energy transfers between trophic levels. So we can say how much energy as a percentage normally is transferred between the trophic levels. We've looked at that previously when we were talking about our food chains, and we kind of said, you know, around about 10%-ish, but there is some variability in it. Calculating these is difficult for a whole host of reasons. So the first of which is that you have to include decomposers. So when we have a food chain and we kind of write it out, we don't typically include our decomposers, do we? Think about the food chains that we've looked at. You know, when we're looking at pyramids of biomass, etc., we kind of had our leaves, we had some aphids, we had some ladybirds, but we don't typically include them. However, you have to, because they have an impact on the transfer of energy. And then the rate of decomposition, so the rate at which decomposers are decomposing something, and therefore how much of the energy they get, varies greatly with abiotic factors. So, you know, damp conditions, for example, winter in some climates, decomposers are more common. So it makes calculating those energy transfers quite difficult, and your efficiencies can vary wildly depending on whether you include them or not include them. It's also difficult as you have to make quite a lot of assumptions before you can calculate the energy of all the organisms. So before you can say, all right, my producer contains, I don't know, let's take my number from up here, before you can say my producer contains 96,680 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy, you have to make some assumptions about them. One of which you have to assume you've identified the most abundant species in an ecosystem. You have to assume that you know how many there are. You have to assume that you know the average body size, and you have to assume that you know the energy that that body size represents. So there's a lot of assumptions being made there, and because they're assumptions, they can be wrong, which can mean that your energy transfer calculations and your calculation of efficiency can be completely different from the actual truth. Temperate regions also throw up an issue, and when I say temperate regions, I mean ones that have quite extreme summer and winters. So here in the UAE, I wouldn't say that we necessarily have an extreme difference between our summer and winter. Obviously there's a difference in temperature, but in terms of everything else, it's kind of similar. Think of some regions of, I don't know, the UK, for example, some regions of Europe. They could have really, really hot and dry summers and then really, really cold and wet winters. And so in those regions, you can see differences. For example, there's more biomass and more energy in the plants and animal bodies in the summer. So in the summer, there's more light, so the plants can photosynthesize more, so they've got a larger biomass, it's passed on through. And then there can be more decomposers in the winter. So because you've got this wet, dark, damp change in your weather, suddenly the decomposers come up. And so in those temperate regions, your energy transfers can be completely different. Your efficiencies are going to be completely different, possibly depending on the season. And similarly, not just in temperate regions, tropical regions, there's a substantial difference between the wet and the dry season. So again, you've got completely different abiotic factors. And so that's going to affect your biomasses, and therefore it's going to affect your energy transfers and your energy efficiencies. It's also worth noting that energy transfer values that are quoted from studies, so say you read somewhere or in your textbook it says 7% of the energy from a particular plant is transferred to the primary consumer. That value that you're being given are mean values taken from calculations, and so they often have large standard errors. So remember, standard error is your measure of how far away your result is from the actual result, and so they've got quite large ones. So it's entirely possible that the value you've got is, a million miles away from the actual truth, because of all of these difficulties in calculating those efficiencies and those energy transfers. That being said, you do need to know how to calculate them, even if this is just theoretical. And in your exam, you might be asked to explain why this is theoretical, or why the true value may differ from your calculation that you've just done in the previous step of the question. But an example, it's just calculating a percentage. So I really do apologize if you feel like I'm being a little bit patronizing here, but just to remind you, this is the worked example from the textbook. I feel it's worth sharing it with you guys just to make sure you've got it in your head, because in an exam situation, sometimes we forget how to do the simplest of things. So assume a question's telling you, sorry, I'll just move this here. So 96,680 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy is available in a plant source. 6,780 kilojoules per meter squared per year is transferred into new herbivore material at the next trophic level. So they might say calculate the percentage of energy that is transferred. Might be the kind of tail end of that question. So we're just going to take our 6,780, divide it by our original, so and then times by 100. So like you would calculate your percentage for a test. What you got out of the total potential times 100. And so you can see that 7% of the energy available in a plant source is transferred to the next trophic level. Okay, so that would be how you would calculate that. Last little bit, and let me move this over again. Yeah, so as you guys saw, 7% in that last calculation isn't very big, and that's not particularly uncommon, and that's not an overly small number. So one of the main effects of this relatively inefficient transfer through the food chains of energy, and foods webs I should also say, is it limits the number of trophic levels. So you guys will have known, I'm sure, from your GCSE work, we kind of don't get any food chains that are 6, 7, 8 organisms long, because of this inefficient transfer. So what that actually means is at the higher trophic levels, so at your kind of tertiary consumers or quaternary consumers, The organisms usually need to move over larger distances. So by the 4th or the 5th trophic level, it could take more energy to find a food and to find a mate than is needed for growth and reproduction. So what that means is the energy supply that you're being given, some of that would obviously be divided up to use for growth, and some of that would be divided up to use for reproduction and kind of supporting the development of a fetus in females, or supporting the production of gametes in both male and females. So some of that energy would naturally go to that. But if the energy it takes to find the food in order to help you grow, or to find a mate in order so that you can reproduce, if the energy needed for those kind of searching processes is more than what's needed for the actual process itself, then life isn't sustainable, because whatever energy you consume, you're going to be using for finding these things, so finding food or finding a mate, and you're not going to have the energy left over needed to actually grow or reproduce. So at some point, the trophic levels or the food chain cannot have any more trophic levels, because the energy available through the transfer is not compatible with sustaining life. So scientists have kind of argued and suggested that this kind of inefficiency of transfers is perhaps why tropical regions have longer food chains than polar regions, because there's more light in tropical regions, so the plants can conduct more photosynthesis, so they have a larger biomass, so there's more energy available in the plants, so there's more energy available at the beginning of that food chain or food web to be passed up through the trophic levels. Whereas in the polar regions, it's obviously more difficult. Those producers are far more scarce, and they're going to have a smaller biomass because the light is far more scarce. So that is a really, really quick run through. Please feel free to watch this video kind of, again, outside of class if you need to, ask me any questions. But kind of your main takeaways from this tutorial, as I said to you at the beginning, to know what GPP and NPP are, so be able to describe them and be able to calculate them, be able to calculate the efficiency or the percentage of energy that is transferred through the trophic levels, as well as explain why these values may be different from the original, well, not the original, but from the actual values, or explain why they're theoretical, explain why these are difficult calculations, and explain why the inefficiency of energy transferred through the food chain limits the length of the food chain. Hopefully that's all made sense. Please let me know if you have any questions.